Anyhow, I'll just tell everyone I have been to San Diego for what it's worth. I was there in 2005, around the time that my book on Thomas Paine and the Promise of America came out. There was a conference held at San Diego State that I gave a keynote talk. And I have to say that I've never been a very big fan of anything about California ever since I was a little boy and the Dodgers left Brooklyn. But I really, really liked, I really did enjoy San Diego, mostly because the graduate student who was assigned to host me, at least show me around, took me down to the beach, and basically had me eating fish tacos just about every meal I was in the area. So anyhow, I appreciate your inviting me. I wish I was there actually to join you in person and maybe eat some more fish tacos. I just want to preface what I'm going to say. I know I have about 15 minutes to talk about the four freedoms themselves, but I want to say that my concern about FDR and the Greatest Generation, because I deal with them together, stemmed from the fact that I've been seriously concerned about American memory for a long time. I hope I'm not speaking to a group of less than progressive Democrats, so you'll forgive me. But we have seen 45 years of war on the democratic achievements of the generation whose lives really as young adults and adults extended from the 1930s into the 1970s, and many lived well beyond that. But it really, when we talk about the four freedoms, I want you to understand that we're talking about a long age of Roosevelt, that the four freedoms are not remembered today, and I'll mention that in a minute, are not remembered today. I mean, you ask people on the street, do you know what the four freedoms are? And if you're lucky, they'll tell you it's the four liberties of the First Amendment to the Constitution, you know, freedom of conscience, basically, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly with the right of petition. But not many people today know what the four freedoms were. And yet, as a historian, I can tell you the four freedoms speech itself probably ranks alongside the Gettysburg Address as one of the greatest speeches in American history. And it defined a generation that was already understanding of what FDR would say on January 6, 1941, but didn't necessarily hear it articulated so effectively until that time. But yeah, the key thing about it is that I originally set out to write something actually about the Economic Bill of Rights speech of 1944, but a lawyer, Cass Sunstein, who a professor at Chicago and then Harvard, and somebody who went into the Obama administration, wrote a book from the lawyer's standpoint, and I didn't want to come out with a book so soon afterwards on that. And my editor said to me, in fact, I can read it to you. I actually keep it on my wall, and you'll excuse the four-letter word that he threw in. He said, you know, I keep thinking, Harvey, four freedoms, greatest generation, American values, how we seem proudest and most nostalgic for freedoms, a generation of values we've seemingly abandoned, if not largely undervalued. How the fuck did that happen? Okay. So he said, you know, it would be good if you would take on a book that explained FDR and the Greatest Generation in terms of that speech, in terms of that idea. And those four freedoms, not the four freedoms of the First Amendment, but rather the four freedoms of 1941, which stand on the shoulders of the original, are, of course, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship. Now, those two are in the First Amendment, but he went on to say, and I'll come back to all of this, freedom from want and freedom from fear. And it was a very much a radical speech, as later would be the Economic Bill of Rights speech. But I think what we're failing to appreciate, because seriously speaking, conservatives, they lambaste the FDR years, though they give credit to FDR, the war leader, and the Greatest Generation for the sacrifices during the war. But the saddest part is that liberals turn their backs on what that experience really entailed. And here's what I would say. We really fail to appreciate that in American history, whenever we have confronted mortal crises, and nobody gets taught this in school, by the way, but this to me is a fundamental thing that we should be teaching our kids, and we should be realizing ourselves. When we have faced mortal crises, and basically I have in mind the 1770s, the 1860s, and the 1930s and 40s, Americans found it in themselves. I mean, despite all their faults and failings, they found it in themselves to radically transform America. And I mean radically transform. So the American Revolution, for all of its failings, created the makings of a democratic republic, an unprecedented democratic republic, and projected a promise in the Declaration of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Civil War obviously was a threat to the very existence of the United States. And again, whatever was eventually left undone and was reversed in the decades following the Civil War, the fact is that the way in which Americans found themselves able to defeat the Confederacy was basically to abolish slavery, to emancipate, to liberate a people from the scourge of bondage. That was a radical transformation. In fact, I mean, I think historians in many cases have come to appreciate that the Civil War in its own way was itself an American revolution, a second revolution in the United States. And then the 1930s and the 1940s, I mean, especially beginning with the 1930s, the Great Depression was the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, absolutely the worst. And though we tend not to believe it, we might easily either have negotiated our way out of World War II before we ever got into it, in which case, frankly, we probably would have ended up with some kind of Trumpian fascism, just for the record. Or we would have lost the war had there not been the New Deal of the 1930s. And when you think about what transpired in the 1930s, it was actually a revolutionary transformation of the United States, and a revolution which in its own way actually continued even during World War II. And this was so really, if we could come to grips with that fact, then we can better appreciate, first of all, what we're up against right now, which I'll happily come back to talk about. And we will, you'll excuse me, I see somebody had over your right shoulder, you've got an image of Biden. Frankly, Obama and Biden to me have been, when you consider Obama was supposed to be the new FDR, the resurrected FDR, and Biden talked about becoming FDR and having the portrait, they are both literally, they failed and are now failing to do the kinds of things FDR would do. And I will explain that. If not in the talk on the Four Freedoms, I'll come back to it at the end, because everyone says, but he doesn't have the Congress. That's not the point. That's not what FDR depended upon. And I'll get back to that. Okay, so what is this, the Four Freedom stuff? Well, I mean, 1930s, as I said, worst economic and social catastrophe in American history. And Americans elect in 1932, probably any Democrat could have won in 32, but they made it a point of nominating the Democrats and of placing into the presidency a man who already had a progressive reputation as the governor of New York, a man who was determined, forget what the historians tell you, he knew exactly what he had in mind, and he laid it out in the course of the campaign. It had to do with addressing the environment. It had to do with improving the lives of farmers, of improving the lives of working people, of creating what was then called old age pensions and would come to be called Social Security. I mean, the plans were there. This was a progressive politician, a man who as early as 1912 was trying to figure out how he could become a progressive without falling into the trap of being accused of being a socialist. And during his, in the years leading up to the 1932 election, despite suffering and enduring polio, which most people assumed would wipe him off the American political map. He came to become the most vibrant political figure of the 20th century, probably. And imagine he won the presidency from a wheelchair. Okay. However much photographers and others cooperated by not publishing pictures of him in the wheelchair, everyone knew he had endured polio and he had risen not so much out of the chair, although he found a way to secure braces that would enable him to appear to be walking, but painfully so. But it is the case that he was a progressive. He was so impressive, in fact, in that 32 year, and he offered a vision of America, which I will in a moment surprise you with, not simply the image and the vision of a New Deal. He also went on, and you're Californians, he gave a speech at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco in the fall of 32. And this is a forgotten speech, but a very telling speech of what his entire 12-year presidency would be about. He said, look, for too long, we have allowed the titans of industry, the big, my words, the big corporate bosses, but he called them the titans of industry. We've allowed them to hijack the American promise. We've allowed them basically to trample on the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said, what we need to do is renew the American contract that was first envisioned in the Declaration. And his idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was that, look, if you're going to have life and liberty, if you're going to be able to pursue happiness, you have to have the wherewithal to do that. So he called for, I assume the Commonwealth Club was made up of elite members, and here he's standing in front of these very prominent, prosperous figures, even in the course of the Great Depression. And he said to them, it is time for us to write a new declaration. And he called it an economic declaration of rights, which would, in essence, tame capitalism and empower working people. That's what he did, okay? And this is in the wake of having already said, you know, we are going to pursue a New Deal. Now, underlying all of that, I'm already going off on a tangent, you'll excuse me. Already, he made a public statement that he said, look, economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings. In other words, he offered one of the most revolutionary statements in modern history, matched only perhaps by my hero, Thomas Paine, who said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. I mean, seriously speaking, it could have been written when he said economic laws are not made by nature, they're made by human beings. He might as well have been Karl Marx in his own way. I mean, that's how radical that sentence was. When he becomes president, his first 100 days are an unprecedented pursuit of legislation that would literally frame the New Deal years right through the 1930s. Now, undeniably, and let's be clear, he had a Democratic Congress. But let's also not forget, it was a Democratic Congress in which all the major committees were chaired by Southern Democrats, because, as you know, seniority in the Senate and the House committees is the way in which you become the chair of a committee. And once you were elected in the South, it was a one-party set of, in the South, the states were one-party regimes. And once you were elected for life, basically, okay? Unless they caught you probably, making love with an African-American woman, you were set, okay, through that time, okay? So the Democrats controlled, but the ability to pursue the New Deal was always going to be hampered by those Southern Democrats, because while they were eager to get federal dollars, look, Southern states have always been super eager to secure federal dollars. They were always really the welfare case of all the states. So what FDR had to do is he had to pursue compromises. Nevertheless, think about what they went on to accomplish. I mean, I could go on and let me just read to you for a moment how I put it in the book. A president and a people, whatever the tensions between them, they created a sort of democratic dialectic, okay? FDR wanted to be pushed. He had a vision of a progressive vision, but as a progressive vision that he knew he could only pursue so far as the American people who were with him. And how did he want the American people to respond? He wanted them to not only give their labors to the New Deal, he wanted them to mobilize and organize in a way that would push him to go further, okay? They subjected big business to public account and regulation. They empowered the federal government to address the needs of working people. They mobilized and organized labor unions. Millions and millions of Americans entered into labor unionism in the 30s. They fought for their rights. They broadened and leveled the we in We the People. They established a social security system. They expanded the nation's public infrastructure. They improved the environment. They cultivated the arts and refashioned popular culture. And while much remained to be done, they imbued themselves with fresh democratic convictions, hopes, and aspirations that enabled them to go on to win in World War II. Now, here's the thing, okay? Here's the thing. Again, we hear today, we heard it with Obama, though Obama had 60 seats in the Senate. He had a filibuster-proof Senate if he could make them move on the legislation he wanted to pursue. Biden does not have that, undeniably, okay? But this is the thing. FDR had two advantages, which he cultivated. One is he got rich people to hate him, and they declared war on his administration. They organized something called the American Liberty League. This is the richest men in America. The DuPont brothers were 36 when he said, "I welcome their hatred." Now, their antagonism towards him in a fashion was empowering. It created a distance between him and these rich folks. You know, originally the rich folks wanted to elect him in 1932. A lot of them wanted to elect him. Okay, why? Because they had this, they figured this out. If FDR was elected, prohibition was going to come to an end, which meant that everyone drinking again was taxable. And as a consequence, the taxes would not be raised on the rich. I'm not exaggerating. This was exactly the kinds of things that they were thinking about. But he surprised them. He not only ended prohibition, he taxed the rich. Directly taxed the rich. He gave one of the most radical speeches ever in 1936, accepting the renomination for president in Philadelphia. And this is the speech in which he called the rich in America economic royalists. You know, he said in 1776, he went to Philadelphia with the idea that he was with a platform written in the form of the Declaration of Independence. And he said, in 1776, we had to fight the political royalists for our independence. Now we have to fight the economic royalists. And he said, and now I've got to remember the exact words because I don't have them directly at hand. He said, they accuse us of wanting to overthrow American values and institutions. But what they're really afraid of is they know that we want to overthrow their power. Can you imagine? Could you imagine a president of the United States talking to American citizens so directly, telling them, basically pointing a finger directly at the forces that brought about the Great Depression and that were continuing to make efforts to bring down, literally, programs that were affording jobs, affording a transformation of the environment, Social Security for the elderly and single families. I mean, this is a president who didn't pull his punches, okay, because of the antagonism of the rich. But on the other hand, he had another advantage. In 1932, when he was running, two major labor leaders, amongst many others, recognized that FDR would be a radical break with the American story of the Gilded Age of the late 19th century right through the 1920s. Those two figures were John Lewis, leader of the United Mine Workers, who was a Republican, and Sidney Hillman, the head of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and he was a socialist. And both of them brought their unions and the union movement basically all the closer to the Democratic Party at that time. So FDR had the antagonists, and then he had these folks. And one of the things about FDR is that he really did want to empower working people. But it was clear in his mind he could not do that if it was not the case that they were mobilized and ready to push him. So this is what he did. So now I'm going to jump ahead and then go back into history. So what outraged me about both the Obama and now the Biden presidencies, with all of the references to FDR, is that not only did we see Barack Obama not fulfill the promise at the least of a public option, but it's also the case that he was ready to put everything on the table. He never mobilized. He ran with yes, we can, but he governed with no, we can't. And he ignored the American people. My students who were revved up for Obama felt utterly deflated within 1 year after his inauguration. He spent his time negotiating with 2 senators from Maine for the American, the Health Care Act. Okay, so that's my complaint. But now with Biden, what have we seen? Well, we really saw a great beginning with the American Rescue Plan, but literally grave disappointment that they could not get a $15 an hour minimum wage. Oh, by the way, a sidebar. You folks in California know that there is a ballot initiative coming up for November in California for an $18 an hour minimum wage, okay? Initiated by Joe Sandberg. Joe calls me his uncle. I call him my nephew. I know that his political aspiration, forgetting the fact that the bank that he founded is called Aspiration, really is a kind of FDR politics in the future. And I hope you guys witness the enactment of that ballot initiative. Anyhow, so what happened with Biden is that he doesn't know how to mobilize. He has no idea that what it would, even if he can't get something enacted. Okay, Manchin and Sinema almost guarantee that. If he wanted to win in 2022, what he needed to do is he needed to literally call out the American people to push him and his fellow Democrats. Americans will not turn out in November because they don't believe it's worth it. Young people have not seen any relief from their student loan debt. We have seen no action in the form of executive orders to create initiatives. By the way, not everything that FDR did was done by way of legislation. A lot of it was done by way of executive orders. The famous Works Progress Administration. There was a vast Economic Emergency Act passed in 1935, but it was FDR's executive order that created the famous WPA. So, there's so much we can draw from those experiences. The point is that FDR engaged his fellow citizens, brought their labors to bear to fight the Great Depression, to transform the environment, et cetera. But he also empowered them to organize. The National Industrial Recovery Act, one of the first things he signed into law in 1933, in those first 100 days, was not simply an American Rescue Plan of a sort. It included in it the right of workers to organize. And it provided for the first federal minimum wage in American history. Now, it's when FDR signed into law that act, it's very interesting what he said. He said, no company should be allowed to operate in this country that did not pay a living wage. He was making it clear when he signed into it that this was just the beginning. And then, even though corporations found their way around the labor section of the National Industrial Recovery Act, Robert Wagner encouraged FDR and pushed him with labor pushing as well. FDR signed into the law the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act, both of which FDR was worried might well be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but they pursued it. The court later there were changes made in the court, and they were not found to be unconstitutional. Now, in the late 30s, FDR had to deal with something that did not exist in the mid 30s. Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans formed what was called the Conservative Coalition. They didn't necessarily publicly embrace they didn't have any kind of formal marriage, but they lined up at times to block new initiatives that FDR wanted to pursue. He wanted to literally go beyond what he had been doing in the first term during the second term. The only thing of really major consequence as a law was the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that continues today to be essential for workers in industry and, well, in their employment activities. Fascism on the march right through the 1930s. Okay, Japan wasn't specifically fascist; it was militarist. Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. FDR warned of these dangers, but Americans generally did not want to get involved in European affairs because they felt they had been burned by World War I. That is, the promise of making the world safe for democracy was disproven by the rise of fascism in Europe and militarism and fascism in East Asia. In 1941, the war was well underway in Europe, and FDR, they knew, they had intelligence, they knew what Hitler's plans were, and I'll just tell you, the plans were, Hitler wanted North Africa not only for oil. This is the famous, the sort of military question. He wanted North Africa because he wanted to be able, possibly, think geographically, to do the leap from Northwest Africa, well, further south, across to Brazil. He had every intention of attacking the United States one way or the other. FDR knew this. And FDR was also worried because Britain was under attack, okay? From the air, okay, the lifelines to Britain were under attack by submarine packs. So it came to the point where FDR realized that it was essential for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. And in very late December, he gave a fireside chat calling on Americans to appreciate that imperative. He had just won his third term as president. Unprecedented, obviously. And by the way, I mean, I don't know if anyone else would have deserved more than 2 terms, but thank goodness there was no constitutional amendment to block a third term by FDR. So he goes before the American people in Congress on January 6, 1941, and he makes it very clear that when the dictators are going to attack us, they will not let us know. They just will not let us know. And he knew that Americans were not necessarily eager to go into the war, but he also knew that they were more than prepared, if attacked or seriously threatened, that they would do so. But he wanted to reassure them that becoming the arsenal of democracy would not in any way reduce his commitment and the government's commitment to the New Deal efforts. And he lays out the imperative of actually expanding healthcare, expanding employment opportunities for young people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he makes it clear that these things are necessary because if we're going to be ready for war, we not only need to be ready in terms of arms, the material of war, we also needed to be ready with a healthy and vibrant generation of young people. And by the way, the best proof of that was when he created the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933. The young men who came in, the 2 million who would serve in the Civilian Conservation Corps, were generally malnourished, unhealthy, and relatively uneducated. And in the course of their service in the Civilian Conservation Corps, they got all the attention that they had never had. Doctors, dentists, education, they were out in the environment. There were literally statistics showing that these young men grew in stature, physical stature, and in health in a way that really was unprecedented in the course of a short period of time. And this was proof to him Okay, further evidence that we needed to be healthy to go into World War II. And so he then, late in the speech, shifts gears a bit, and it's as if he is looking over beyond the war, and he says that in the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. And then he shocked people. He said, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. Now listen carefully to what he says, because Americans heard something different than he said. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. Now, I said to you a moment ago that Americans heard this differently than he actually said it. When Americans heard it, maybe because they found it hard to believe everywhere in the world, but they imagined that they were going to make the New Deal all the more real in terms of its impact on everyday lives. When the vast number of Americans who were still suffering poverty, or for that matter, the working poor, heard freedom from want, they absolutely believed that in the future, the United States would create living wages for all, that in fact, people would not go hungry, that jobs would be afforded, et cetera, et cetera. When he said freedom from fear, African Americans, who undeniably did not benefit from the New Deal as much as white Americans, but did tremendously benefit. I mean, the New Deal was racialist all too often because of the Southern Democrats preventing agricultural workers from coming under the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security preventing, it was not applied to agricultural workers, which meant African-American workers in the South could not organize or secure Social Security benefits. And Mexican-American workers in Texas and California could not either, okay? But when they heard the speech, they thought these things would be overcome, okay? Freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from fear. African-Americans thought that this actually would be the end of Jim Crow. And as Eleanor Roosevelt reported, and a host of Northern journalists reported, when freedom from want was stated, the Republicans sat on their hands. When freedom from fear was stated, the Southern Democrats sat on their hands. Otherwise, if you hear the tape of that day, you will hear incredible applause, incredible applause. Well, those were the 4 freedoms that would become, if you like, the slogan, the manifesto of the American war effort. Now, FDR said that when the United States entered the war, he said that he would no longer be Dr. New Deal, he would become Dr. Win the War. But you know what? In 1944, when the war was still very much underway, this was January of 1944, another State of the Union message. And let's not forget that in 1944, it was June 6, 1944, that D-Day occurred. And of course, later that year, the battle in which my father fought and was wounded, the Battle of the Bulge occurs. So this is before the war itself is in any way won. And not to mention the expectation that the war in the Pacific might go on far beyond the war in Europe. FDR went before the American people and Congress, and he said, basically, the war's not over yet. We must continue. He laid out a series of initiatives that might be necessary to pursue. And then he said, and this really was an amazing speech. He said, you know, we have come to realize that needy men are not free men. And whenever he would talk in those terms, whether it was the Economic Declaration of Rights, the Four Freedoms, and now he's about to present the idea of a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, he always reached back into the American story. FDR actually was the history teacher in chief as well as commander in chief. And he lays out a new Bill of Rights. Now, I want to make something clear. FDR was a genius, politically speaking. But it wasn't simply because he had this vision of an economic Bill of Rights. In late 43, he actually commissioned secretly a series of national surveys through a research group out of Princeton University. And they were given the task of asking Americans, what do you want after the war? What would you like to see the government and the American citizenry secure after the war? And what he found out was basically Americans wanted the New Deal all over again. Moreover, give you examples, 83% of Americans, 95% of Democrats, 75% of Republicans wanted national health care. Straight out, national health care. Similar kinds of figures, in some cases higher, wanted a guarantee of public education. They wanted a guarantee that young people would be able to pursue education as far as their capacities could take them. They wanted guarantees of decent housing. They wanted guarantees of food on the table. They knew what America could accomplish. They saw it in the New Deal and the war effort, and they wanted the kind of economic security that Roosevelt had been speaking of ever since 1932. Imagine, to round up, 85% of Americans wanted national health care. And that's exactly what he laid out in the Economic Bill of Rights. It was so powerful a speech that Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York at that time, who ran for the Republican nomination and secured the nomination for president that year, was this close to actually declaring in favor of some kind of national health care. Americans knew what they wanted, and politicians did too. Now, here's the thing, however. At the end of his speech, he warned of right-wing reaction to block these kinds of initiatives. And he didn't mean the likes of the Tea Party or the likes of the KKK or the likes of, QAnon. He didn't have those folks in mind. He was convinced it would come from big business. He actually said, this may well come as a rightist reaction from business. Well, he didn't get an economic Bill of Rights. He knew he could not secure it because of the conservative coalition. The Republicans would oppose it. The Southern Democrats would have welcomed it if they could have left African Americans out of the rights. But he was very insistent this was going to be for all Americans. Why were they so afraid of national health care? Because if a national health care bill had been enacted, the Southern Democrats would have had to desegregate hospitals, which is why they have always been, those folks have always been primary obstacles after the war to national health care when the overwhelming majority of Americans wanted it. So, but nevertheless, FDR did get a version, a rendition of that vision. It was called the GI Bill of Rights. 16 million Americans served in uniform in World War II. Okay, 400,000 never came home. Almost 1 million came home injured or wounded in some fashion. 12 million young Americans, those were Americans, Black, white, Latino, men and women, enjoyed the benefits of the GI Bill. It was the greatest, and I say this not to disparage it at all. It was the greatest welfare program in American history. And it worked. It helped to create the middle class of the 1950s. And it literally transformed the energies of the American economy. Between the New Deal, World War II, and the GI Bill, the post-war America, with 1 of every 3 workers in a labor union, keep that in mind, 1 of every 3 workers in a labor union saw the reduction of poverty, the expansion of the suburbs, schools, hospitals, libraries. They were the greatest generation because they had radically transformed America in the 30s, in their teens, in their 20s. They had defeated fascism, but we don't give them credit. Oh, we celebrate the war, but we don't realize the radical transformation that occurred. And those, by the way, they were 15 years old in 35. They were 25 years old in 45. They were only 45 years old in 65 when they elected the most liberal and progressive Congress imaginable under Lyndon Johnson. And really, Johnson, again, talk about faults and failings, we don't have to go there, but Johnson himself had been basically, like, he called himself the nephew of Franklin Roosevelt. He headed up the Texas Youth Administration. He served in the administration. He served briefly in the Navy. I mean, again, for all of his faults and failings, he was the liberal of the 60s, not John Kennedy. Kennedy always would tell people after the war, I'm not a liberal. I'm not a liberal. Eleanor Roosevelt had little desire to see John Kennedy become president. She probably wanted Walter Reuther, the labor leader, but that's another story. But LBJ saw himself completing the New Deal, which is based, Medicare, Medicaid, the Immigration Reform Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the laws that protected the environment, the laws that would literally regulate business in an even more effective way than the New Deal had regulated business. And by the way, another proof of the generation, and I'm going to mention somebody who we all think, well, he's from your state, not my state ever. Richard Nixon was one of those greatest generation folks, and he knew damn well what his own generation wanted. He ended up spending more on the war on poverty than LBJ did. Famously, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who a lot of Republicans believed was going to be a conservative president, as he told his brother in a letter. He had two brothers, a liberal one and a conservative one. His conservative brother wrote to him and said, when are you going to start acting like the conservatives that we want, right? And he wrote back and he said, any party that wants to mess around with labor law, Social Security, farm subsidies, he laid it all out, the entire New Deal. He said, any party that wants to do that will never be heard from will never be heard from in this country again. And he said the exact same words to his press secretary in 54 in the midterm elections. I mean, Eisenhower actually expanded in many ways in the New Deal. He opened, he fulfilled the Social Security. I believe it was agricultural workers were covered during the Eisenhower years in Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act. It was those kinds of things. I can't guarantee on the National Labor Relations Act, but on Social Security. So really what we're talking about is a generation that even after FDR's death in 45, continued to transform America. Look, we could talk about McCarthyism, the racism, we could talk about all of that. It's nevertheless the case. In 1965, those same folks were 45 and they elected that Congress and that president, and they saw those laws enacted, And later, the great myth is that they were the ones who turned around and voted for Reagan, which is bullshit, by the way. It was young folks who voted for Reagan. People don't go back and look at the numbers. And by the way, Reagan would never have won if Carter didn't turn his back on the FDR tradition. I mean, everything Reagan did, Carter did first. Deregulation, the rejection of labor law reform, the rejection of consumer rights over and over again. It's the FDR, the age of Roosevelt, as the great historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. put it, the 30s to the early 70s. So, I mean, I had a whole outline of things I was going to tell you. I just want to make it clear to all of you. Don't let them tell us they can't do it. Right now, we know Build Back Better is dead. We know that. I mean, they're not going to legislate anything. But why the hell can't they learn to fight and to mobilize Americans who are yearning to be reminded of who they are and to start pushing back on the bullshit of the Trump years and 45 years of war on the democratic achievements of the 30s and the 60s, war on workers' rights, war on women, war on voters' rights, which especially means African Americans. I mean, we've seen this for 45 years, and for too long, we've allowed neoliberals to rule the Democratic Party. That's my argument.